so to join in, and then we will get started. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for the webinar. We already see a great number of people. Well, just to clarify, the person who you see on the screen is our speaker, and that's not me. I'm Shubhendu. I head the global marketing team at Cigniti. We are the world's largest independent software testing and quality engineering services company. We work with enterprises globally. We assist them in accelerating their digital transformation. We leverage our IP by bringing the power of AI into Agile and DevOps, this webinar is a part of our thought leadership series of webinar, which we host every month. We invite leaders from different industries to and have them share their updates and their experiences of how they have navigated through. Now, today's world, QA and IT leaders from enterprises across the globe are faced with overwhelming need to deliver quality at speed. While many of us are aware, and many are aware, that shifting left helps us to create highly productive development life cycles and definitely faster time to market, they are often unable to implement it due to resistance they see visible, invisible from the organizations. So with this as the topic, we thought that this is a very a topic which is worthwhile to discuss, and we wanted to introduce the speakers for the day. We have Rob Lavelle. He is the Vice President at Cigniti. He is a thought leader in the domain of software quality assurance, has over 20 plus years of experience, consulting experience with clients across different industries, and has worked across diverse project locations, and also was in the US Army at Pentagon, a global bank in Frankfurt, a global energy firm in Cape Town, major semiconductor manufacturer in Shanghai, and many more. These are some of the clients which he has worked with. Rob, welcome to the webinar. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Mendo.
And our guest speaker is Marianne. She's the head of technology at Monsoon Accessorize. She has worked in retail for more than 30 plus years. In this time, she has gained valuable insights while leading projects for enterprises. In addition to Monsoon, such as Marks & Spencer, Mothercare, Selfridges, and many more. She has first-hand experience of testing, testing time being compressed to hit the go-live dates, and with a high risk to quality, cost, and actual go-live dates. Retailers are always cost conscious. That's something which is very normal. We all of us know that. Now, hence, it is key for her to make the case for engaging QA from the very beginning of the projects to help achieve business outcomes. Marianne, welcome to the webinar. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure.
Right. It's going to be a great session, everyone. So I definitely want to get quickly aside and allow Rob to take over. But before that, to all attendees, I just wanted to tell you that if you have questions for the speakers at any time during the webinar, you could use the panel on the right and locate the chat button. It's the one with two bubbles in there. And you could just type in your questions in there. We will cover them at the end of the webinar. And I would now like to hand it over to Rob to take it forward. Over to you, Rob.
Good. Thanks, Shubhendu. Thanks.
Rob, can you just check if your audio is right? Can you just unmute yourself?
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Very good.
Phew.
All right, I'm gonna share again. Okay, here we go. That's the wrong one. Anyone want to see my calendar? There we go. Okay, good. Now can you see end here?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. So, well, thanks everybody again for joining. And so the first thing you'll see in this slide, let me first make a point. So when I first created this slide, I actually used the word tortured speakers. And then I dialed it back to tormented. And then Marianne said, well, maybe we'll just change it to exasperated. And the reason for that is I read an article not too long ago, a white paper, and I didn't realize, but it's actually been 16 years since this whole concept of shift left has been really introduced to the IT world, even though it's been used in automotive manufacturing for 50 years. So the exasperation comes from really because of the titles. Why do we need to convince people? Why do we need to use economics in the case of this conversation as a lever to convince people? So we're going to walk you through here and kind of maybe rekindle what the topic is all about. We'll talk about, sorry, I get the slide to change. We'll talk about the problem at hand. We'll go into keeping a very high level, talking about the solution, and then some ideas about how you can make sell the idea of shift left, and then make it stick within your organization. Okay. So let's start with the problem, and I'm going to use a more visual problem space to talk about this whole concept of shift left inequality with a motorcycle. And if anyone's been on my LinkedIn page, you see me sitting on a motorcycle. I've been riding motorcycles for 40 years. This particular motorcycle is one that I owned. I bought it about 10 years ago. It's from a company called Aprilia. It's basically a racing motorcycle that has number plates and headlights. And it has puts out 180 horsepower and a top speed of 190. I only went to 183, so I can't really vouch for the top end capabilities. But maybe with a tailwind and going downhill, I can make it happen. So here's what happened with Aprilia. And I asked Marianne, probably if I could do a poll right now, and I asked the question, do you know what this is? Do you know what this is? So let me explain. So this is a connecting rod. So it is the wide hole connects to the crankshaft, which makes the wheel go around. The small hole connects to a piston, and that motorcycle is a V4, so it's got 4 of these in it. And it is, without a doubt, the most stressed member in any combustion vehicle because this one in particular, when I'm going 183 miles per hour, goes up and down 216 times per second. So what happened with Aprilia is they use a supplier for this particular part, and it was designed and manufactured to standards. Obviously, it was tested along the way, but they didn't do any batch testing. So this particular batch of about 5,000 affected 5,000 motorbikes was installed into a lot of motorcycles. So let's just pretend that this connecting rod is an interface in a very, very large IT system. And connected to the interface are a lot of dependencies, whether it be data schemas or it might be transaction codes in the SAP world. So put it in the context of the motorcycle. So this is a cutaway view of the RSV4 engine. And you can see that you've got the cylinder and you've got the piston there. I don't think I can point. Yeah, there's the piston. Down here is the crankshaft, and that connecting rod connects these two things: the piston and the camshaft and the crankshaft. So as you can see, from a manufacturing perspective, this is the ultimate embedded defect because it's not like you're going to take it to the shop and they're going to do a recall, they're going to replace it. So what Aprilia needed to do, which was the right thing, obviously, this is just in the UK, 800 motorbikes were affected. They just replaced the entire motor. So they had to ship out entire motors, new motors to all the dealerships to swap out on those bikes, 5,000 pounds each. Then obviously all the labor involved and obviously the damage to their image in the market, massive PR expense. But the bottom line here is that as it relates to the IT world, you can understand that the impact of not focusing on quality from the very, very beginning of the production manufacturing cycle, in our case, the SDLC, can lead to excessively high costs. So let's just talk about now the historical quandary now of shift left in the world that we live on. So Marianne, from your perspective, obviously you've managed many IT projects. I'd like to get your perspective on how the mood changes from the time we kick off and what sometimes happens when we don't focus on quality at the beginning of the program.
Yeah, this diagram is so familiar, and it absolutely describes how we approach projects. And certainly I've only ever worked in retail, so I think probably we approach things with a lot of enthusiasm and maybe not a great deal of reality at times, because it's all about news and that stuff, and isn't it exciting, we're starting something new. And that whole feeling at the beginning is we've got this great project starting, it's so expensive, and we've got the money and we're going to change the world. And we start with all the good intentions, and we talk about vanilla is best, and we say change the process, not the system, and we say focus on the outcome, not on what we do now. And that's the right way to do it, but we get lost along the way. So that when you get to the second bit there, delays and fixed delivery deadline, that's because we start to realize that we oversimplified it right from the start, that we are trying to build into a legacy landscape, that we have our middleware is suboptimal, whatever it might be. So all these complexities start to come through and the reality starts to bite, but that end date's not going to change. But we still have to finish the job in hand. And that's where we start to see these violations of the stage boundaries. And that's when people start questioning whether we need to test something or why we're testing it, or do we have to test it so thoroughly? And then, of course, we do, because we start to find defects. And that's when it becomes really difficult, because suddenly everybody's just testing. And we're spending an awful lot more money because we've had to put so many more testers on it who are going to find the defects, which then go back into development to be back into test. And we start this horrible cycle. So that last phase, where it should have just been the same sort of size as everything else, is suddenly elongated or getting much deeper because you have to throw so much resource at it. So I think that, sorry, Rob.
Sorry, I was about to say, you have this concept of in a project life cycle of the valley of despair. And yes, usually somewhere in the middle, but I'm sure a lot of people on this webinar right now are test managers. I think from a testing perspective, the valley of despair is at the very end.
It's downhill all the way, that's for sure. But what I would say though as well is that everyone forgets that when we come out the other side and it's finally live and you move into the sunlit uplands, and we don't learn the lessons. We need to do that. So when we talk later, we'll talk about learning some of those lessons. So the next slide, I think, describes very well what happens to real projects. So I was managing an Oracle RMS implementation a few years ago. Something I would say straight off is that no retailer is going into a greenfield site unless you are absolutely a startup. You've already got a lot of legacy stuff there. The stuff that already exists. There's processes that have developed over time. There are people who've been there for time and say things like, well, we've always done it like this. But a lot of people have forgotten why we do it. So you're not starting with a blank sheet of paper, even if you think you are. And then when you go into waterfall methodology with, you get your kickoff, requirements, design, development, testing. The first thing that goes wrong is the requirements, because a waterfall, one, it assumes that you collect all the requirements at the beginning, and you don't. People remember things much later. They go, I've got a must-have that they didn't even think of at the beginning. The requirements always end up being more complex than we expected, because very few businesses can stay vanilla. There will be reasons why, partly because they have to accommodate the rest of the landscape, the legacy middleware or not fit for purpose middleware, or processes that have built up for good reason, which I would dispute with quite a lot, but it's there. So you start to see a bleed through that stage gate already, where requirements are still being gathered, but the design has started. And that's not necessarily a bad thing at that point, but then it keeps bleeding because then the design overruns as well. So now you're over the next stage gate. But that's okay, because we can start building the stuff we have designed. We haven't got the whole picture yet, so we can't do end-to-end. We can't do SIT, but it's okay so far because we've still got all this time to that go live, so we'll catch up. But the development will overrun because, again, It was more complex. There'll still be new requirements coming in. So you've breached another stage gate, and actually you've probably breached it by even more time because this is cumulative. But that hard line at the end, your go live, doesn't change because that will have been set by the business for a reason. And that could be, certainly for us, it will always be Christmas peak. We would never, ever put new strategic or mission critical systems in after September because Christmas is so vital that if we miss anything, the business is doomed. That's when we make profit. So that go live date can't move, or it'll shift a whole 6 months out so that we can start again in January. And that's very costly as well. So what squeezes? Well, it's testing, because that's what's left. Testing and training, totally squeezed in. So what do you do at this point? So this is all hands on deck, right? Everybody gets involved, but the business analyst is still working on refining those missed designs. And the business are trying to run the business, and they weren't expecting to be, so tightly involved in testing at that stage. So you get this squeeze, and that's where the quality goes out of the window as well, because you start compromising on acceptance criteria. You start compromising on exit criteria. So what you put into live isn't really what you intended. And that's where we get a bad rap. It's always tech that get the bad rap because we delivered a subpar solution, but this is what happens all the way.
Yeah, churn the entire time. And so in your experience then, when, for instance, and by the way, that little explosion is supposed to indicate a defect. So you had a defect that actually came because of some miscommunication, misalignment, misunderstanding and requirements, but it wasn't actually detected until SIT. Yeah.
And that's absolutely the most common thing. And this is where I would like to see, and my current project, I'm saying we need quality management in right now, because if our quality managers are able to sit with the business and understand the requirement, not just the design, but the requirement, to understand what the business is trying to achieve here, they can test to that. Because something might not work as designed, but it may work as intended, or vice versa. That happens too. But the other thing that we can achieve then, if we have quality management in nice and early, they can help with course correction, that when they see multiple change requests coming in, when they see complexity building up, when they see the design veering away from what that requirement was, they can do the course correction and be the honest broker almost that says, hold on, that's not what we were going for, bring it back. Because I've seen, and again, this was with an Oracle deployment where we had mods that we needed to do. The complexity, it just spiraled. It just became so complex. And so the time's just bleeding away and you still can't meeting your basic outcomes. So putting quality management in at the beginning gives you the opportunity to design the flaw out, not fix the flaw when it's already in.
Right. And I'm sure a lot of people are scratching their heads saying, well, we're using Agile now and we're using CI/CD, we're using DevOps. And obviously those methodologies are able to short circuit a lot of this problem because the cycles are much, much shorter. You're working with Scrum teams that are all working together. But nevertheless, you can also look at, oftentimes in my experience, looking at sprints sometimes just being a waterfall and microcosm. And to be honest, in my experience visiting dozens of clients in this space over the last 15 years, not many clients are still using waterfall or some hybrid derivative that usually has some aspects of waterfall as well. And probably the reason so many people are on this call right now is because they probably think that they're still using this methodology as well. Okay, so
and I think there is a place for waterfall still, but I think we need to cut it down into chunks that allow us to fail fast and fix it fast. So we may not be able to be agile. And certainly in the econ world, it's much easier. It's a standard way of working now. But when you're doing a re-platform of a big system of record, it's difficult to be agile, but we could be smarter. Mm-hmm. And the other things that we've certainly found that in retailers, and I suspect this applies to many, many environments, possibly less where compliance is a big issue. So I think utilities and banking possibly aren't hit quite so hard with this, but we find that our testing gets squeezed even further because the environments aren't properly maintained. We don't have proper configuration management. So the test environment, the dev environment doesn't look like the prod environment. So the build and the tests up to that point are invalidated, because the minute you put them into production, it's not the same thing. Test data is another one. I've had horrible experiences where testers, in order to hit deadlines, have cut the test data set down until only successful data sets are processed. So there's no error handling, there's no edge cases tested. There's no sense of what happens if it goes wrong, because it will. You know, one of the ones that we've come up against recently is that customers put special characters into their name. So we found customers were quite often calling they were putting an emoji in of a little house just before they put their home address in, so that they could differentiate between their home and business addresses. And we couldn't parse the emoji. That's a totally unexpected thing. We didn't know, but because we were on a modern platform, it had error handling built into it, so that worked. Leading spaces, trailing dots, you know, all these sort of things, they don't get processed properly, and the data set has to reflect all these weird things that our customers do. So we need to have very, very like production data. And if you're spending a whole load of time creating new data sets, you're losing test time. So again, that's even more squeeze. Yet again, it's tighter. The other thing that I think I've seen, particularly in Waterfall, not in Agile, is that testing is seen as a hygiene activity. It's seen as something you do at the end to tick the boxes rather than to assure quality. One comment I had during an Oracle implementation was, why do we even have to test it? It's Oracle, it's going to work. Well, no, it isn't. That's not how it is. And especially, but you know, your configurations are a risk, but mods are a huge risk. So that's a big part of it, that we have to start seeing it as a quality management activity, not just something you tick the box with at the end, because it's much more than that. And then we have to empower our quality managers. They have to have the authority to say to the project manager, to the SMEs, to the developers, no, you've gone off track here. Come back to where we were, and authorize that course correction. That's a big one, and that's difficult because culturally that's not what we're used to. The PM tends to be all powerful. We have to empower our quality team.
Those are good lessons and experiences from the real world, and we'll talk a little bit later about some approaches maybe to try to bridge those gaps. So I said at the beginning, so 16 years later, we're still doing this, and it's not because we're not capable of learning. And for those of you maybe not familiar with the term cognitive dissonance, so it's a behavioral science term that refers to a type of behavior where we do something even though we know it's wrong or that it's bad for us. And the standard example is smoking, right? So we know that that's cramming out all the testing and it's done at the end. All this reactive, all this detective kind of work that we're doing at the end is a bad practice. But nevertheless, why do we do it? So Marianne, why do we do it?
Oh my God, an hour is not enough to go through all these things. But one of them is certainly, if you are a very cost sensitive business, as most retailers are, we are very focused on controlling costs and at maximizing profit. So it's very reactive. A couple of bad weeks, especially during sort of February and March when sales are low, that can throw a project off completely because the cash flow dries up at that point. And the priority is to cover payroll. And I'm in agreement with that, cover payroll. And that makes people very nervous. So then they pull back on committing. There's absolutely a seasonal thing about getting projects approved. It's much easier to get them approved in the summer. There is also a sense that if they see testing costs all the way through the resource plan for a project, that it's higher than it would be if it was just at the end. But of course, nobody forecasts it going wrong. You don't put a forecast in that says my test resource will be small during the dev phase and then it's going to blow up exponentially during the test phase. But that is the reality of it. And I think perhaps we need to get a bit better at talking about, and Rob, you've got some really detailed stuff coming up about what the true cost is if we don't do it early. So there's this idea that it's more expensive to bring them in early. Another thing that I've come across a lot. Retailers don't routinely change their big monolithic systems, their ERPs or their systems of record, like their finance or HR systems often. You don't need to. If it works, it works. So the application that I'm currently replacing is 25 years old. But the original business case would have probably been based on a useful economic life of 5 to 7 years and a payback of 3 to 5 years. So it's really difficult to get the right capex cost, because you need to pay it back in about quarter of the genuine life of that product. Mm-hmm. IT pays back a lot longer than people reckon. I've mentioned that we focus on testing later. It always becomes an end thing. BAs, again, I mentioned that they've got sucked in because of all the boundary breaches earlier. They've now got sucked into rewriting requirements, checking designs. And there is this perception, again, of testing as a hygiene factor, rather than as a gatekeeper. We're using the phrase here, gatekeeper. It's always the testers that tell us to stop. It should be the PM saying stop, because my trusted advisor in the quality management team has said stop, and we need to give them that empowerment. And again, this using that test phase as the buffer, testing, training, it's always the buffer. And we need to learn. And I think one of the things is, yes, Rob, you're right, we can learn, we do learn, but we're learning too slowly, because when we come out of the project, everyone's really high. Everyone goes, this is amazing. I remember putting in a restaurant system that traced allergies. It was a really important project. The only benefit case was at least we know what's in there. So if somebody dies, we can say we did our due diligence with allergens. That was it. I mean, it was a terrible business case.
Right.
And there were arguments all the way through the whole project about what should be done and blah, blah, blah. At the end of it, we did a lessons learned. And the most contentious member of the team said, it was so much fun. And I thought, you're remembering what you want to remember. You're not remembering the hard slog. And we do that. We bounce out of it and go, everything's great. And we forget to play those lessons back into the next cycle.
Yeah, I've been there as well. I managed large testing programs for clients in different industries. And once you're actually in the machine, it's very, very difficult to take the time to kind of look holistically at what you're trying to do. I did have one program that I managed, an SAP program for Chevron. This was like 10 years ago, and the PM was completely bought into the idea, and it worked extremely well. But let's talk about the universal impact before we start talking about money. So before we get to production, Marianne hit on a couple of these. So once you're in that squeeze situation, that squeeze to the right, you're going to have to make hard decisions about scope of your testing, and most likely you're going to make decisions that are going to diminish that test scope, or you're going to diminish, for instance, the data sets that you're using, or choose happy path only. You're going to eliminate, like Marianne said, about the environment. So when the testing starts, and you do not, once you get to sit at least, have basically an end-to-end system as it's envisaged for production, then it's impossible to test production-like tests. It's impossible to do true end-to-end testing or system integration tests. Now, obviously, there are things like service virtualization that kind of help bridge that gap, but nevertheless, things like this could be avoided. And the final thing, and there are many, many others, obviously, is that testing is supposed to be an independent arbiter of quality. In fact, I hate the word testing. I'm going to say that 100 times. So what you miss then is you sacrifice that independence and impartiality, right? You're basically forcing them to get stuff done. So on the production side, leads to high defect leakage, rework costs. You have to do a lot more regression tests. Sometimes you have to phase functional releases or phase geographic releases that you didn't intend. Workarounds, big pain in the neck. Go live delays, obviously not very well looked upon by senior management. And then obviously there's financial, the bottom line impact. And so they're going to show you a slide next that really gets it down to dollars and cents, and really should be in the arsenal of trying to convince anyone that is responsible for cost accounting why this is so important. So this data has been gathered. And if anyone working in QA, you probably know this verbatim anyway. This is data that's been gathered over a long period of time. I think about a 10-year period, 150 different companies, incorporating, I think the number was like 13,000 projects over time. And so obviously there are a lot of statistical relevance to these numbers. So the message very simply is, on average, if you detect a flaw during the design phase, when basically we're just talking about paper and documents, is about 140 US. That same defect on average will cost you 14,000 US to fix in production. And there've been many, many, many instances in my experience where this number has been true. So if we use those numbers as a basis, so what I did is I managed a large SAP program for Deutsche Bank while working with Accenture about 10 years ago as well. And we had about 5,000 defects. So I just took the 1,000 Sev1, Sev2 defects and plotted them. So if you look at this this plot, so this is basically bucketizing each of the defect sources. And you see in the first one thing to point out in the two circled ones, dotted line circles, is that about 40% of the defects are in the design requirements phase. So stuff that's like way early on. So what I calculated here is there's the first line is the distribution, adds up to 100. Then the number of defects based on the distribution in each one of these buckets. And based on the cost that we just had in the last slide, to fix all of these 170 design defects would have cost about 24,000 US. If 50% of those defects had only been discovered during the SIT phase, only 50% of them, the cost of fixing that bucket of defects now goes up to 358,000 US. So across this entire X timeline here, what you see is a net increase in the cost of fixing these defects is almost $2 million. All right. So the total number to fix that source, $140,000. To fix 50% during SIT, so much later in the SDLC, number goes up to over 2 million. All right. So powerful numbers and kind of indisputable for anyone who's actually ever worked in this domain, because we understand what happens later on. Just like my motorcycle example, it's not just going in there and replacing a part, because now it's part of an interconnected system with interfaces, with data, with transactions, et cetera. So it becomes very, very complicated.
It does, and I think in my experience, this to me was when you first showed it to me was a really powerful slide, because when we have tried to look at this before, I've been involved, and I think I've just seen in the attendee list a project manager who worked with me on the particular Oracle project that I've been talking about. So I hope she's going to back me up when I say this. We did some analysis after the project about where the defects had originated, and it was in the design phase. And this is just looking at the comments coming up as well. Ben, you've said that you've suspected bugs can be traced back to pre-coding activities. But when you suggest that to the architects, to the designers, they're very defensive. They'll say, no, it's not with us. The requirement must have been expressed wrongly. And it becomes a blame game rather than let's solve it. So if we could solve it early, then we don't have to have that blame game. We could say, oh yeah, okay, we got it wrong. Fail fast, fix fast. That's what we have to get into the habit of doing, and recognizing that things can go wrong before a single line of code is cut.
Right. I can't see the comments, so hopefully they're nice ones. All I see is my screen. Okay. All right. So let's talk about a solution, not necessarily the solution, but this is something that I've been pitching for a long time in white papers and discussions with clients. So quality from day zero, and again, trying to purge the word test and testing from vocabulary is a good place to start. So as is usually the case in these types of overall solutions, has really three components: people, process, and tools. So I'll just walk you through each one of those before we start talking a little bit more about quantifying. So I guess I would love to be able to just like ask for a raise of hands if we were actually in a big room. But for those of you who have worked as test managers before, how many of you actually feel like you were empowered within that program? And there's a brilliant, before I went into testing, I worked in supply chain for a long time. So I used to help companies implement supply chain management software, for instance, for manufacturing. And the way that this has transpired, like I said, 50 years ago with Toyota, with Mr. Deming, was that over time, the whole concept of quality was so bought into that everybody that worked on the production line who witnessed a potential quality problem had the authority, was empowered to stop the assembly line until we can figure out what was causing that problem. And in my experience, that doesn't exist in software development or software implementation. If you're a tester, we love you until we hate you, and it's often the most stressful job on a project. So something needs to change, and this is actually what happened to me on that. It was like a $500 million SAP project for Chevron global implementation, and I was brought in from the very, very beginning of the project. I was given several months to write the strategy, and I had a seat at the table on the steering committee, and So you really need to, step one, really appoint who that person is going to be. And a person should be a punching bag. It's not a low-ranking position. And ideally, it's someone who's reporting directly into the project manager, even up to the stakeholder level. The next thing is to engage them from the first day one of the project. So like Marianne was talking before, it's if there's a tendency to say, well, we're going to save money, we don't need that test leader, test manager, quality manager until a couple of weeks before testing starts, then you've already got a problem. All right, because again, forget about testing. It's not about testing. It's about quality. It's before a single test is run. These people need to be engaged, or at least that single person. Next is, like I said, about the authority to make decisions, and that, for instance, is being a strong controller of the stage gate process to make sure all of the criteria that were set to be able to move from one to the next have actually been met. And then finally, it's not just the testing, it's test team, it's the entire team that really needs to understand the importance of quality from the very beginning. Not from a perspective of creating a drag on the velocity of the program, but making sure at the end of the bottom line, we delivered a solution to the business that is cheaper and better than if you would have not started thinking about quality until at the end. All right, Marianne?
Yeah. I think this is, and again, I'm looking at the comments, and I think everyone's kind of saying this. There's several questions coming up that I would quite like to answer. One of them is about bestowing the authority, and one of the questions that has come up was, are our testers our problem? No, they're not the problem, but we have to help them be the solution and give them that authority and that gravitas to say, guys, there's something wrong here. The other thing that I think is really clear is that actually the decision to go or no go, the decision to accept the risk or not accept the risk does sit with the steerco. It is not up to the quality manager to say the project stops here. It's up to them to say, this isn't actually what we said we'd do. Do you want to go ahead with it? And to describe it as a risk, which I think is really important. But we then need to walk the walk on this, because you can give somebody the authority, but if you're not going to listen to that person, you may as well just run test scripts and say everything's passed, because you need to value that advice. There's no point, if you went to a lawyer, you wouldn't say, well, thanks for that, but I'm not going to listen. I'm going to do well, maybe you would, but you shouldn't. You're paying for, yeah, I was just thinking that's a really bad example. But you are actually paying for professional advice here. We should listen. We need to walk the walk on this and actually listen to these quality managers. That's what they're there for. And with clothing, we would not send out a substandard dress or shoe or whatever it might be. We shouldn't do that with software either.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about process. And there's a lot here. And obviously it's huge to even think about trying to implement all of these. But the main message here is there are processes that drive quality from day one or day zero of the entire SDLC. You see here the elimination of the word test until we actually get to the test phase, and I'm not going to talk about that because we all know what that is. But starting with requirements, So, and this is a problem we all know. Maybe sometimes some of us don't know what it is, but the fact is, requirements change. And if you do not have a traceability between requirements, the design specifications, the technical specifications, and the tests themselves, the actual test cases, then you have a fracture. And then you as a test lead running the test program, the actual execution of tests, you don't know that those requirements have changed. Maybe you don't know that the tech spec has changed, et cetera. And that needs to go both ways. So we find that the tech spec has changed because of some constraint, then that needs to propagate backwards back to the design and the requirements themselves. Defect prediction. So this is one that really doesn't come up very often. And I've been really focused on this now for a long time. We do a lot of estimates to figure out how many people we're going to need to write a whole bunch of design specifications, to do UAT, but we don't really take the time to estimate how many defects we're going to have. And the data is there. And obviously the defects drive so many other things in cost. They obviously define how many retests we're going to have to do, but they also define our rework costs. So having visibility as a benchmark to actually eventually work down over time is really helpful here. And requirements ambiguity test, just ensure that we have conversations and all ambiguity in language is eliminated. And it sounds very simple, but in my experience, it happens all the time. Like you said before, Marianne, it's like the business says what they want, but then what we designed is what they asked. It was what was on the design, but ultimately it wasn't what they asked for. There's a disconnect.
Yeah, and we see an awful lot of that because they describe what they do, not what they need. Mm-hmm. And that's use cases are really important in this to describe, this is in my role, this is what I need to do in order to achieve this to this standard. If you can do that, you've got a requirement, and then how we meet that requirement shouldn't matter, but users quite often just want to see a replication of what they've always done before.
Right. So let's jump to design. So design traceability, kind of talked about a second ago. Behave in agile environments, but also can be used in waterfall. And that is simply that the test is driven by how we expect the system to act, and the test actually then drives what is actually designed and developed. And there are tools to support it, and it's a very effective approach to trying to drive out ambiguity. On the build side, code quality tools, test environment management, obviously the bane of many people's existence. It's such a beast to be able to manage, but to be honest, in my experience, it's usually not managed very well. So creating a very detailed strategy and design and document to be able to manage environments is actually critical, because poorly managed environments, poor configuration, lead to massive problems in production, as one of my current clients has found out. And continuous integration, service for virtualization I mentioned before. In sprint automation, if you are using Agile, so being able to have your tester, your test automation engineer be part of your Scrum team, and they're actually writing, whether it's through BDD or other means, writing test automation while your solution is being designed and developed are critical. All right, and then others, ORT, et cetera. So the point is I purposely did not focus on testing, because we all know what that's about. Testing is about detection, and I've written an article a couple years ago, and I see it as one of the most value destroying activities in business, because it's about finding the things that we did wrong instead of trying to build the quality in from the beginning. All right.
Completely agree.
Okay, and then finally, just talk about tools, and then we'll wrap up and open up to questions. So there are tools that support the management of deliverables. And yes, you can use spreadsheets, but there's no way you're going to manage bidirectional requirements traceability or traceability throughout the design of the solution without using tools to support. So obviously these are tools off the market, like ALM tools like Micro Focus and Sentence and Cucumber. On tools that drive efficiencies, first thing that comes to mind, obviously, are test automation tools like Selenium, like Worksoft, like UFT, and then finally tools like Cast and others that support the validation of quality in the actual build. So obviously there are many tools involved, but the whole concept here is the people, the process, and the tools to help manage quality as effectively as possible.
Yeah, I agree. I think with tools as well, one of the things that I have to quite often say when business users come to me with an idea, quite often all they're trying to do with the new system is make their bad process work faster. And that's kind of not the point. We should look at process engineering. And I think with tooling, you have to be sure you know what you're looking for before, you can make Excel your tool if you need to, but you have to do it right. So the tooling allows you to be faster and do more volume, but you have to understand what you're after in the first place.
Right. So this is the last section of this conversation. And so we talked about the problem. We talked about the solution or a solution, but now it's about how do you actually sell it? And Marianne, obviously in your position, you have to sell it every day. I'm on the other end of it. I'm usually the person that's brought in once the decision has been made to focus on quality. But the question is really, how do you make it stick? And I've got a couple of thoughts, but I'll stop there for your thoughts.
It's a really interesting one because, as I say, I think we don't learn the lessons fast enough from previous deployments. So every time I ask for investment in non-production environments, it's why? What do you and even though we have said in previous projects, this is not a valid test because our environments were not aligned. So we need to help people learn the lessons. We need to change the language around testing. We have to stop saying testing. We have to talk about quality assurance, quality management, right first time, about smoother landings into production, because something we didn't dwell on much, but operational readiness. If it's a bumpy landing, it's your service team that are going to hate you. It's your help desk that are going to go, hey, guys, we've just taken 1,000 calls. So all of those things are what's in it for me to support early engagement with testing, with quality assurance, with quality management. And of course, then a graph like this, this is the sort of thing that I think we all ought to do as part of our lessons learned, is look at the true cost of getting it wrong for every project. So we start to build up a body of evidence that says, this is what it cost us because we didn't engage early. Exactly. And then that really does stick. Right.
The problem is it's quite difficult to do.
Yes.
And so I'll give a couple of insights. So one of the first things is, so I don't have a background in IT. Actually, I have an MBA and I studied economics. So I went into consulting, IT consulting, and then kind of tripped into QA. And I actually had a heavy debate with the CEO of an SI that I worked for 6 years ago about the whole, I was the global head of testing, and I hated it. And so I made the pitch to change the name to business assurance. And the reason why is that I see testing as a value destroying activity, and we needed to change our philosophy that what our mission is about is assuring that what is actually delivered to the business is what was actually promised at the beginning. And any business that makes a decision to implement a very expensive enterprise software system does it because they think that the payback is going to be positive. So we need to bring in economics, very simply, business focus to testing. So with that, you make a business case for the net economic benefit of shift left. Then you need to really create this culture of quality. And it's really difficult to do because, again, you're trying to convince people that just see testing as bolted in, pounded in at the end, there is a better way, and to create you can create a disdain for rework by quantifying it. And I
absolutely love that phrase. I think that's so important that we should not say, well, we'll fix it later. No, we shouldn't be doing that.
Right. All right. And then, so finally, is to develop a quantitative metric to track the cost of quality. So cost of quality, in case you're not familiar, And really, there is no, I should probably write a really no set way of doing this. But ultimately, it is the net result of, and actually these two should be reversed because the cost of poor quality is worse, is more. But the idea is that you try to quantify the cost of creating that culture, creating the training. You can do that through your timesheets, et cetera. To how much it's costing extra to engage your test lead from day one, to create a strategy, to create a quality framework, create the metrics, the tools, and the cost of early detection, so early testing. All right, so those fall into that bucket of preventative cost of quality. So trying to find those errors, those misalignments or defects as close to when they actually have their inception point as possible. Okay. And then subtract, and then we've got the cost of poor quality, like what I said. I mean, it typically is more and sometimes a lot more. And that is, for instance, things like, and this is not an exhaustive list, but bringing the testing at the very end, you're going to get them up to speed. A lot of inefficiency. The cost of late detection, the cost of rework, cost of running retests, all those squeeze-driven delays, defect leakage, and negative corporate image. And I've more than a handful of stories from business, and one of them was a very large still is a very large telecommunications provider in the United States, where a defect led to their e-commerce platform where they sell all their phones and their service to be down for it was like a day and a half, and cost them $3 million in top line revenue just from that day and a half. So it becomes very, very clear that not getting things right can have significant impact, not just on project budgets, but on the share price of your company. And
I think the other thing to consider in there as well is that there's a negative impact on your customers. But what about your teams, your internal teams? If you give them poor systems, if you don't give them the tools to do their job, they're not going to hang around. Teams work together when they have the right tools for the job, when they feel empowered, when they feel valued. You're going to lose talent if you don't implement well.
So ultimately, I can't really see what I wrote here because I've got some little window in the way. But so here's a suggestion, and this is the way I've done this in the past to kind of get you started. So first of all, it's best to start with data, right? It's kind of difficult to do this with a program that's currently running because all the wheels are going 100 miles an hour. So look at a past project where you've actually collected a bit of data and analyze and root cause all of your Sev 1, Sev 2 defects, and do your best to try to figure out where, and this could be a sample, it doesn't have to be all of them, but sample where those defects had their origin and where the defect was actually found, okay? And then try to get a hold of the hours to your timesheets of the people who worked on those defects and figure out what it costs to fix the defect. And then sit around with your team, maybe in a post-mortem, and say, well, we spent 100 hours on this Sev 2 defect. Oh, sorry, Sev 1, make it a hard one. Now, we as a committee, what do we think that one would have cost to fix if we would have found it at its source? And maybe you got one person that would just know. That would have taken 2 hours, but it cost us 100. And start to build up that business case. All right. And then, so do this. And again, you don't have to use all of these, but try to come up with a picture of your cost of good quality and your cost of bad quality, and then determine a baseline cost of quality number. And once you've got that, you've done in the past, and you put together kind of these basic metrics. And when you've got all your metrics that you're running anyway, like retests and delays and Sev 1, Sev 2 defects, also kind of do your best to maybe on a monthly basis start to tally up what your cost of quality is in that breakdown. And it might really surprise you, especially if you decide to run a project, calculating that metric without actually implementing shift left. And you don't have a clear picture of what this looks like. So Marianne, so from your perspective, So you're trying now to set, just hypothetically, because I want to talk about your current environment, because I don't know if your boss is watching, but like hypothetically from a past life, when you were trying to sell this concept, would something like this work for you, do you think, or might be too labor intensive?
I think if we have the data, we should start using it. I mean, we talk a lot about data-driven decisions and things like that, and we really need to start doing that and collecting the data. So, for example, timesheeting is something, and we all know how much we hate timesheeting, and we make it up as we go along, and but actually there is huge value add to that data, and I think possibly we should focus the time we do it, but we should definitely do it. I'm sorry if you can hear my dog barking in the background. I'm really sorry. I've got a delivery arriving because
I figured it's the Amazon guy. Always the Amazon guy.
It is the Amazon guy. It is, I'm afraid. So apologies for that. Yeah, I think we should do this, and I think it's something that in an organisation my size, it's something that I should undertake with my test lead and do it as a very small, very focused little activity. But then we start to build the data over time that builds that case. I'm lucky that we are quite a small team, which sometimes is difficult, but it also means that we have, we all have a voice and we have influence, and we need to start using that. And as I said earlier, we need to walk the walk with this and start saying, this is better, I'll prove it to you, because we will deliver this project on time and to budget. And I think that's the biggest proof, isn't it? If you can do that and have users at the end going, yeah, that was quite good, actually. That was all right.
I would probably get in trouble with my bosses if I didn't mention that we at Cigniti, this is one of the things that we do. So we have a group within our organization, our advisory group, basically our consulting group, and they help set up these types of metrics, gather the data, do the analysis, and help you give you a picture just as a starting point to figure out how to put you on the path to a business assurance approach. And this is the last slide. And so what we're saying there is try to end the cognitive dissonance and think about the fact that, and maybe validate the fact that the way that you're doing it might not be the best, even though it might seem the cheapest approach. It might seem like quality is just okay, when in fact it's actually a lot worse than it needs to be. And try to get your team and your superiors bought on to the concept that doing something right the first time really makes sense. All right, so Marianne, any closing thoughts or comments from you? I think we've right near the top of the hour.
I think we are. We've talked and talked. I've been looking at the questions as they're popping up. I hope we'll get the opportunity to respond to some of those, even if it's by email or in a different way, because there's some really interesting questions coming, things that are making me think as well about some of the things we've said. I think we are pushing on an open door if we can provide data to the decision makers or the budget approvers. Then they'll work with us on it, and they will start to understand it. But we have to believe it and be passionate. And I hope you've seen, I am passionate about it. I think we would have so much better outcomes and so much, the diagram at the beginning, the ski slope at the beginning. I do think we'd get more and more despairing about projects as they go on, and we should be able to lift that. We should be able to be confident as we go into those final phases and start planning cutover that we're going to put something good in. And wouldn't that be such a great feeling?
Excellent. Perfect way to close. So, all right. So I don't think we've got like a minute left. So Subendo, I don't know if you're on, if there are any other questions you want to focus on, or that we're just going to let everybody know that we'll follow up and respond with answers to those questions that we received.
Yeah, I think Rob and Marianne, thank you so much for this amazing session. This was such a great conversation. There has been so many questions. And I mean, so what we will do is post this session, we will take, because now we are at the top of the hour. So what we'll do is we'll take all of these questions, share it with both of you. You can respond to each of the questions, and that's how we will take it. And for all of the attendees, if you have any further questions which you probably have not been able to answer, or which arose based on the conversations with Marianne and Rob had just now, you could just drop in those questions to marketing@cigniti.com as well, and we would add that up and get back to you as well. So
yeah, and obviously we're both on LinkedIn as well.
Yes, yeah. So very happy to take questions through LinkedIn or to connect with people if they think it will be useful.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rob. Thank you so much, Marianne.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Session. Looking forward to host you again for many other such webinars as we do them going forward. Thank you so much. Everyone, thanks for your time, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.